Hello and welcome to Exploring Religion. I'm Dr. Kegan Chandler, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about Orientalism, monotheism, and the theology of the early modern Japanese Christians, or the Kakure Kirishitan, or literally the hidden Christians of Japan. These are three very controversial, very challenging subjects in their own right. And today we're going to throw them all together and see just how controversial we can get. But I do hope that it's interesting for you and maybe even a little helpful for starting to think differently about these three challenging subjects. Now, this episode is actually based on a paper that I presented at the ASRSA meeting in Cape Town at the end of 2023. That's the Association for the Study of Religion in Southern Africa. And the full article was actually published open access in the fantastic Journal for the Study of Religion. So if you're interested in a much more comprehensive argument than what I'm presenting here, I would definitely recommend you take a look at that article, because what you're going to be seeing here is mostly a short form presentation, or the cliff notes, if you will, of a much more detailed study. And also, that being said, I'll go ahead and warn you that in today's episode, you might be encountering some technical terminology used in the academic study of religions that you might not necessarily be familiar with. So be on the lookout for that. And I will try to do the very best that I can to define my terms along the way. But without further ado, this presentation is centered on the intersection of three very challenging topics. First, what post-colonialist scholars have called Orientalism. Second, the concept of monotheism. And finally, studies of early modern Japanese Christian theology. In other words, studies of the doctrines of the Kakure Kirishitan, or the hidden Christians of Japan. And by the hidden Christians, I mean those Japanese Christians who were famously driven underground by government persecution in the 17th century, and whose descendants improbably, miraculously reemerged from hiding when Western missionaries returned to Japan in the 19th century. Now, my suggestion in this presentation will be that in some modern studies of this Japanese Christian theology, despite their situation in the so-called post-colonialist era of religious studies, some of these studies have unwittingly maintained an Orientalizing tendency to, on the one hand, essentialize and abstract an inauthentic Japanese Christianity, on the one hand, as one which by nature misunderstands monotheism. And then, on the other hand, to contrast this with a Western Christianity which is faithful to monotheism. And if all of that sounds like a lot, what I mean by all this will hopefully become clear in the next few minutes, along with a warning which I hope to impart about the persistent dangers of cultural essentializing and otherizing as a form of devaluation of religions. But to start, we need to define this term, Orientalism. In 1978, Edward Said utilized a few interrelated definitions of Orientalism, and in one of them, he described a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and, most of the time, the Occident or the West. And it is this pattern of cultural dichotomization that I have in view when I'm referring in this presentation to Orientalism. And our central question is as to whether or not this dichotomous and widely criticized approach to the study of religion, whether this has been sufficiently abandoned in studies of Kakure Christian theology, or if there's still something to worry about. And I suggest that we may be able to find out whether we've sufficiently abandoned this Orientalizing dichotomous tendency by considering how some Western scholars have answered the question of whether the Kakure Christian theology is monotheistic or not. There has long been a history in both Western and Japanese scholarship which has treated the relationship between monotheism and Japan as one of non-comprehension. For many decades, this has been something of a standard view. that not only is monotheism something that is not, quote, Japanese, it is something that is not congenial to what has been called the Japanese mind. So it's widely said that, excuse me, when the Jesuit missionaries first came to Japan in the 16th century, that pre-modern Japanese people, because of their Japanese mind, they could only misunderstand monotheism and also the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. They were culturally predisposed to misunderstand, to be unreceptive to it. And even the Christian converts, it is often said, ended up transforming monotheism into something Japanese. In other words, something that is not monotheistic. Famed scholar of Japanese religion J.H. Kamstra once spoke of the Kakure Kirishitan as a group which exemplifies, quote, how the Japanese mind conceives and modifies typical Western ideas, such as monotheism. Easily observable, I think, in this quotation is an essentialization and an abstraction of the Japanese mind as something which is uniquely or especially unreceptive to the concept of monotheism, something which only absorbs monotheism insofar as it can transform it. And I have another quotation here from Miyazaki Kentaro, who in his Handbook of Christianity in Japan from 2003, he similarly concludes that the Kakure Kirishitan cannot truly be Christian because they insist upon a, quote, very Japanese view of multiple spiritual beings and have therefore so transformed their theological inheritance that it has become thoroughly Japanese and quite distant from a Christian monotheistic worldview. And this is more or less the same view of Japan as a religious swamp which swallows up Western ideas that was so famously painted by Catholic author Endo Shusaku in his novel Silence, a famous dramatization of the Jesuit padres and the Kakure Kirishitan who are suffering beneath the oppression of the shogunate. And I have my copy right here. This is the 1980 edition. Highly recommended novel, by the way, if you haven't read it. And if you're not too faint of heart, there's also the Scorsese film adaptation from 2017, highly recommended. And for the real diehards, there's also the Shinoda film, the Japanese production from 1971. But in Endo Silence, Japan is famously presented as a place where Western ideas go to die. Western ideas like monotheism are only able to be swallowed up by the swamp of Japan, swallowed up and recapitulated as something less than Christian. For Endo personally, he seems to have conceived of an essentialized Japanese mind that was at work in the history of Japan and in the present day. A sensitivity, a Japanese sensibility and culture, which he sees as inherently insensitive to God. And ultimately, according to specialists like Crystal Whalen, the Kakure Kirishitan are ultimately not Christian. And this is because Christian ideas about God, they simply have no cultural bedrock on which to rest in Japan. It is the very concepts, she says, the very concepts that were introduced to the Kakure Kirishitan, such as the Trinity, which were, quote, either never fully digested or they resisted understanding what did not appeal or seem relevant to them. And by the way, Whalen is a fantastic scholar. And if you're interested, you absolutely must get a copy of her translation of the Kakure Kirishitan scripture, the Tenchi Hajimari no Koto, or the beginnings of heaven and earth. This is my extremely marked up copy. It's just brilliant. You can buy a copy on the internet. It's not very expensive. But back to monotheism. Again, scholars like Whalen and others have depicted a Japanese misunderstanding of monotheism or of the doctrine of the Trinity that is embedded culturally and therefore psychologically in the Japanese people. And while I'm critiquing this, I do want to point out that I am not suggesting that there were absolutely no intellectual difficulties with the concept of monotheism among any of the Japanese people of the early modern period. Rather, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm aiming to provide here is a warning to scholars about an ongoing generalizing and essentializing, which I see as counter to the facts of history about monotheism in Japan. But before we consider these facts of history, I want to first address just a few of the reasons why I believe that modern studies have felt compelled to portray Japanese Christianity as not monotheistic and the Japanese in general as being culturally unreceptive to monotheism. Whoops. We first of all need to look at how the categories of polytheism and monotheism have been treated in the study of Japanese religion in general. For a very long time now, there has already existed a widespread scholarly impulse to separate Japanese religions from perceptibly Western or Christian concepts, categories, and terminology. For example, words like religion, words like liturgy or prayer, doctrine, and of course, monotheism. These terms have sometimes been deliberately excluded. And I think, on the one hand, this has been because of a Japanese nationalism, especially in Japanese scholarship. But on the other hand, both in Japanese scholarship and in Western scholarship, there's been an earnest post-colonial motivation here, an aim to prioritize Japanese self-definition rather than Western categories and concepts, which are thought to have been imposed in the history of Western scholarship. This is an effort that we could say to let the subaltern speak, to borrow from Spivak. And the final result of all of this, at least in Japanese public discourse, is that a homogenous Japanese religion ends up being described as something that is inherently peaceful, it's inherently tolerant, it's a form of polytheism rather than this harsh, abrasive, invasive monotheism. And for the in a typical Japanese discourse and in political discourse as well, this polytheism, it's something which can stand against a violent or intolerant Western way of doing religion. And these categories, Japanese religion, Western religion, these end up being ciphers for Japanese culture versus Western culture or civilization in general. So what I see is that this widespread separation of Japan and the West on an axis of monotheism, this is actually part of, excuse me, what scholars of Japan have called myths of Japanese uniqueness, based on the famous study by Peter Dale in the 1980s. And these narratives, these nationalistic narratives, I see have actually been supported or reinforced by Western scholars who have similarly identified monotheism as a unique aspect or a trait of Western civilization. You can find plenty of Western scholars who say things like the West is a monotheistic civilization. And this reinforces, again, these nationalistic Japanese narratives, which essentialize Japanese history and culture as polytheistic. So I think all of this background will ultimately give us a clue as to why Japanese Christianity, quote, Japanese Christianity as a category, why this would pose so much of a problem for cultural assumptions in Japan, based on an assumption of a categorical tension between Japan and Christianity, or Japan and monotheism. A Japanese Christianity, that's going to be something of a contradiction, right? Okay, so now that we've set up this dichotomy, this essentialized image of Japan versus the West, I want to offer a brief historical challenge to this image Specifically, I want to offer a historical challenge to this idea that a basic monotheism was absolutely unknown or even incomprehensible to the Japanese people during the early Tokugawa period, or during the period of the emergence of the Kakure Kirishitan and their persecution. And we could talk about many examples in this regard, but in this episode, we're going to have time for only one, I think, very pertinent example, and that is the case of Fabian Foucan. Fabian Foucan lived from 1565 to 1621 and wrote a very famous text called Ha Daiusu, or better known in the West as Deus Destroyed, written he wrote this about 1620. And Foucan is an anti-Christian writer, or at least that's what he's most famous for being. But Foucan is actually a former Christian himself who left the Christian and turned to Buddhism. And from there, he began to argue quite vigorously on behalf of Japanese religions against Christianity. And if you want to get a look at Foucan's amazing text, this here is the classic English version by George Ellison, a fantastic work, which contains quite a lot of other writings from this period, including a fascinating work called Kengiroku, or Deceit Disclosed, by a former Jesuit priest named Cristobal Ferreira. And this is the character who is played by Liam Neeson in the Scorsese film, a character who gives an incredible speech that I won't entirely spoil, about how the Japanese can only transform monotheism into something else. They don't understand monotheism. It's really amazing. But Ellison's book really, really is fantastic. It's a classic work that you definitely need in your library. And by the way, this is a Kirishitan on the cover. Hopefully, you can see this here. This is from a propaganda piece, an Edo period print depicting a Kirishitan. I think this is actually a batarin, or a padre, but you'll note the long tengu nose. A tengu is a Japanese goblin or ogre, so watch out. These Kirishitan are quite monstrous. But anyway, back to Fabian Foucan's writing. In his text, Deus Destroyed, it is important to note that Fabian Foucan, when he confronts Christian monotheism, he does so not by pointing out its foreignness or its incompatibility with the Japanese mind or the Japanese worldview. Instead, Foucan's tactic is to challenge Christianity's claims to originality on this point. He writes, quote, "What is so amazing about all of this? What schools fail to discuss this?" Foucan then points out that in Shinto, in the Shinto classics, the very first of the heavenly kami is Kuni Tokutachi no Mikoto. Also in the Kojiki, that's from the Nihon Shoki, the first is Kuni Tokutachi no Mikoto. In the Kojiki, it's Ame no Minakunushi no Kami, but these two figures were often identified in Japanese history. But Foucan describes this great deity as one who, quote, opened up heaven and earth. And in light of this, he says, quote, "Why then do the adherents of Deus press their tedious claims with the pretense that they alone know the Lord who opened up heaven and earth? Idle verbosity without substance and most annoying." He then concludes, "But let us go no further. Let us take up the example of Kuni Tokutachi no Mikoto. How could you ever say he is a mere human, he who was a god before even one human existed, before heaven and earth were opened up? Don't dare say it. Don't dare say it. Accept as understood the things you can understand. Admit you do not fathom the things you cannot fathom." Wow, I'll read that one more time. It was really striking to me when I first read it. "Accept as understood the things you can understand. Admit you do not fathom the things you cannot fathom." Wow. I think that Fabian Foucan would probably argue with the same energy today against those modern scholars who, like the Jesuit missionaries perhaps, have insisted that monotheism is something that the Japanese can't understand, that it's the unique property of the West, of the Christian West. that it's something incompatible with or incomprehensible to the Japanese people. In my view, it is not that the Japanese could not understand Christian theology. Rather, I see that they simply disagreed with certain aspects of it. For example, the idea of a transcendent God versus a kami who is immanent in nature. I would point out that a failure to accept Christian doctrine is not necessarily a failure to comprehend Christian doctrine or monotheism. A very important distinction that may or may not be have been missed. And proving this out, like I said, I could cite a number of different studies which I see have perpetuated this essentialized image. But I'll in this video, we'll just focus on one, and this is from a scholar whose work I appreciate and enjoy very much, Dr. Stephen Turnbull, and we're going to look at his very well-known account of Kakure Christian theology. Now, Turnbull, again, who's a fantastic scholar, despite my criticisms here, he says that the Kakure Christian are polytheistic. This isn't surprising, again, but he explicitly says this because the Kakure, they acknowledge a host of spiritual entities or heavenly beings. Including Christian martyrs, Shinto kami. They also utilize holy images and objects. So they are polytheistic rather than monotheistic. And ultimately, Turnbull concludes they are, quote, not Christian. Now, interestingly, Turnbull does acknowledge that there is some affinity between Catholicism's devotions to saints and their use of relics and holy water and holy images. However, Turnbull describes these as merely polytheistic tendencies of popular Catholicism. Meanwhile, for the Kakure Christian, these are not mere tendencies. Rather, he says that what they're doing is downright polytheism. Kakure beliefs and practices, he says, they stretch the any derivation of their practice from Catholic theology to its breaking point. He says they push theology beyond the bounds of a definition of monotheism. He says into polytheistic territory. But when I read this, what I want to know is, what is the justification for this uneven application of the definition of monotheism? Again, in traditions like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, we encounter a host of supernatural entities, including demons, Satan, angels, various saints. There's a host of heavenly powers in the form of saints, and even holy objects, holy water, iconographic veneration. And while these elements in these Christian traditions are understood to be monotheistic, they immediately seem to disqualify the Kakure Christian and the Japanese in general as not monotheistic. Or I should say, they're disqualified from the category of monotheists. So I don't understand why this is disqualifying for them, but it's not the case for Catholic or Orthodox traditions. That's the point I'm making here. I'm asking, on what basis are Catholic practices declared mere polytheistic tendencies, while the Kakure Christian practices are evidently so thoroughly destructive of monotheism that it makes them polytheist and ultimately not Christians? I see that for Turnbull, it is ultimately, quote, the Kakure's inclusion of non-Christian deities and objects of veneration, which stretches monotheism to its limits and beyond. So apparently, if the Kakure Christian had limited their worship to Western figures, well, maybe they might have remained monotheist. If they had kept to Christian saints, to Christian relics, Christian veneration practices that go beyond the one God, maybe they could have stayed monotheists. So if this is the case, then it seems that what's being targeted here is monotheism and its contact with Japan. That is what is thought to destroy monotheism. When monotheism enters Japanese waters, it becomes magically something else. Or maybe to utilize Shusaku Endo's imagery from Silence, Japan swallows up monotheism like a swamp. So, again, my point in pursuing all of this is to ask whether the Christian West is called monotheistic because of an essentializing tradition which simply declares that this is so. Or is what's going on here actually a scholarly application of the category of monotheism? I'm not so sure about that. I think it's very possible that what we're observing is a post factum justification for an a priori separation of Japanese religions and Western religions. And I fear that this may be the very epistemological and ontological separation of religions and cultures, which Edward Said decried so famously in his book, Orientalism. But again, as I said, there's plenty more argumentation in the full article on this subject, which again is published open access. I'll put a link to it in the description of this episode, where I bring in a lot of other data, especially focusing on the category of syncretism and how that is deployed or seems to be deployed in a certain way for the Kakure Christian theology, but isn't deployed in the same way to assess the very colorful history of Western Christian traditions. So, concluding this episode, I'll offer just a few more, probably rather controversial points. I see that in the history of Western studies of religion, Orientalism as a subtle dichotomizing pattern of engaging with religions has been rather difficult to detect. But I suggest that it's very important that we be on the alert for Orientalizing tendencies, because I think as scholars of religion, when it comes to monotheism, the study of monotheism, we are in great danger of allowing post-colonialism to become an inversion of what some of us think the colonialist project is all about in regard to religion. For some of us, it seems that colonialism is all about the imposition of Christianity or the imposition of monotheism on subaltern contexts. Therefore, it can quite easily become the case that for some people, post-colonialism becomes the extraction of Christianity, the extraction of monotheism from subaltern contexts. But for me, this is a problematic application of the post-colonialist ethos, since the particularization of religions, the particularization of Japanese religion, is something which Western Orientalists imposed on Japan in the first place. So I am afraid that this Orientalizing history that I've described has only been reiterated or perpetuated in modern studies, or at least some modern studies of Kakure Christian theology. Okay, so that does it for this episode. Hopefully, you have enough to think about. Hopefully, it will succeed in generating some conversation, maybe some disagreement. I welcome all of it. So please leave me a comment. And of course, like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in these subjects. And we'll see you next time on Exploring Religion, where we will continue to discuss the situation of Christianity in Japan and the study of monotheism and related issues. Until then, take care. Bye bye.